Okay, so the question we are investigating is, why was it so easy for these people, these brothers, to sell Joseph without any kind of deed of slavery or whatever in the first place? Let's see. Oh, okay. So Rashi says, because it says Ishmaelites first, and then it says Midianites, and then it says Ishmaelites. This is to communicate that he was sold several times. So I guess that sort of answers that by the time he got to Egypt, there was such a chain of selling that it did feel legit. But the question is still, why were the brothers able to so easily?
Because that was the first time, wasn't it, that he was sold into slavery, right?
Right, when the brothers did it.
Yeah. I guess once a slave, always a slave after that. I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah, I don't see a good answer to that question. I guess it was just like accepted. If somebody was being sold into slavery, it was for a good reason. There was just not a lot of questioning it.
He annoyed the crap out of us, so now we're going to sell him into slavery, just very casual.
Yeah, why not?
Boy, if many
Just
kids
little
knew,
Judah things.
many brothers knew about that, boy, there'd be a lot of people sold.
You know, Esau gets such a bad rap throughout tradition, not just in the scripture itself, but throughout tradition, for his attempt at killing Jacob. The brothers do actually, they don't just say, I'm gonna kill you. They like take significant violent action against Joseph, and they get a redemption arc. That's just occurring to me now too. That doesn't seem very fair.
Well, but that's, I mean, that's part of the story too, that you can do something and then redeem yourself later. And they, everybody grew up but Esau, you're right, doesn't get a chance. His story comes to an end. Well, he does. He does, because he and Jacob make up at the end, right? And
they do make up.
And Esau had a chance to I mean, Jacob was expecting them to all to be killed, and he didn't. He made up with him, and they lived happily ever after, separately, but
yeah, they made up, but then it's not like they were together. I don't think there is a lot of fairness in the Torah.
That's true.
And I mean, I tend to think, interpret, if you will, the stories in terms of relationships and what can we learn from relationships?
Right. And there is a lot to be gleaned from the Joseph story. I think I've talked about before that I find it kind of weird that some of the earliest Bible stories our children are taught are the Noah story and the Jonah story, I guess, because animals are cute and children like illustrations with the animals and whatever. But like those are both kind of horrifying stories.
Yeah.
Joseph's story is another one that often gets, it's very played up in like children's Bibles or whatever. It's a narrative that kids really grasp onto. And although like this specific part with like throwing him in the pit and let's kill him, let's not kill him, let's just leave him to die. No, let's sell him into slavery. Like that conversation is pretty disturbing, but overall, it is like, it is a good story narrative that I think has some very obvious lessons. Not to say that Noah or Jonah don't have good lessons that would be applicable to children, but they are a little bit deeper. Whereas like this one, it's pretty surface level, like get along with your family, don't play favorites, don't if you are the favorite, don't play that up, don't play your brothers against each other, don't, um try to get along. There's just a very strong lesson of Shalom Bayit throughout this parsha, and then as the narrative goes on about forgiveness and redemption, and as Debbie said, like, I mean, now I'm jumping ahead quite a bit, but the brothers really do like learn their lesson. I mean, we do see that. I think there's still ulterior motives at play with the whole, like, if we go home without Benjamin, our father will kill us or die, or both. We can't do that. But the fact that they have learned to care about that in the first place,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
there's growth.
And the lesson of consequences.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like they really didn't think through that. They thought like, oh, if we just take Joseph out of the picture, then our father will love us more. And they didn't consider like, no, our father will mourn the loss of Joseph and still be mad at us. Like,
And take our Xbox away.
yeah. Whatever the biblical version of Xbox was.
X
Ate
tablet.
my favorite lamb for dinner instead of.
Yeah.
Yeah, the original tablet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Less eye strain involved.
But then, I mean, to take an even longer view of this, the idea of fate sort of comes in too, because what would have happened to the Israelites if Joseph hadn't been in Egypt
Mhm.
and started that whole story? And so it doesn't talk about God's hand in here, but
Yeah.
it's
So
like
two things.
one of the children Hanukkah stories that I read has a town is very poor and doesn't have enough oil for Hanukkah or to cook or to light their lights. And one of the poorest people says, well, he's going to pray to God, and everybody poo-poos. No, God's got better things to do than so he writes his prayer on a piece of paper, and the wind takes the paper and blows it to town, and it lands on the balcony of a rich man. And the rich man reads the paper and says, oh, these people need my help. And he fills up his donkeys or whatever with oil and potatoes and all the rest of it, and goes back to town. And the story goes on from there. But the point of the story is that God is the one that made all these things happen.
Right. Right. I think so. There's two facets of that theme that I think is really important. The one on the literary side, is that God does tell Jacob that I think it's Jacob. Maybe it's Abraham. One of the times he's like establishing the earlier covenant, he warns your ancestors will be as great as the sands of the earth and as many as the stars in the sky, or other way around, as many as the sands of the earth, as great as the stars in the sky. But there will be trials and tribulations between now and then. They will spend 200 years in Egypt. So it's all part of God's plan. The whole thing, the whole trajectory appears to be intentional. But also to the point of, so that's the fate aspect, but also the faith aspect is that I think it is really significant that Joseph doesn't talk to God. we know that Abraham, at least Abraham and Jacob, and probably Isaac, although Isaac is very terse, but there's a reason that we say the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob when we name them, because they had that personal relationship with the divine that is noticeably lacking between Joseph and God, despite the fact that Joseph has this this divine gift, this faith, this he prays in the prison, he prays to God. There's clearly faith from Joseph, even though he doesn't get the kind of response his father and grandfather and great-grandfather got, which is, I think, very beautiful also.
Is there any significance to, sometimes Jacob is referred to as Jacob and sometimes he's referred to as Israel? Is there particular meaning to the times when each name is used, or?
Probably.
A lot of,
Find an example of Israel and see what the rabbis say.
37, now Jacob was settled, and then several sentences down, it says, now Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons. So in 1, he's Jacob, and in 3, he's Israel.
I don't see commentary, and at least not in on Safari, and none of these guys are saying anything about it. Yeah, all the commentaries on this verse are about the ketonet pasim, the colorful tunic. Does God speak to Joseph through dreams? So here's the interesting thing about sorry, just to say to Debbie, I'm sure there's commentary or midrash on that question somewhere. I don't know off the top of my head. I would say that probably it might have to do with different authors and traditions coming together.
Okay.
In the canonization. And we could always just make up our own answers. I love doing that. But to Joel's point, so Joel put something in the chat about prophets and dreams, which is a good point. And certainly we see that in the books of the prophets. We see that with Miriam, that Miriam is a prophetess, but she doesn't have the kind of interpersonal relationship with God that Moses has, and things like that. And there's commentary on that, on the parsha where Miriam and Aaron are arguing that they are also prophets. Then the midrash on that, or the commentary on that, says, like, specifically, God usually speaks to prophets through dreams. Moses is unique in getting to talk to God face to face. Although, like I said, I think at least Abraham and Jacob also have similar face to face, whatever that means with God, conversations. But as for Joseph's dreams, what I think is interesting is that in the beginning of this parsha, he's having the dreams, and they are like they turn out to be accurately interpreted, but I could totally see why to his brothers they sound like delusions of grandeur. Like they're his own dreams, and he's coming out and saying they mean I'm great and you're all gonna bow down to me one day. If somebody said that to me, I would think they were nuts or arrogant or some combination of the two.
Particularly if it was a sibling.
Particularly if it was a sibling. But even if it wasn't, I don't know. If somebody's
Yeah.
dreams, if somebody tells me that the literal interpretation of their actual dream, not like I have big dreams or whatever, but like
Right,
last night I dreamt
right. That I was
XYZ,
going to rule the
and that,
world.
yeah, that I'm gonna rule the world. That would raise several alarm bells for me.
And a couple diagnoses.
Yes, potentially. But then later, in jail, he interprets the dreams of those two other imprisoned men. What I think is interesting about that, well, there's a few, but specifically, what always catches me is that there's no transition, there's no explanation of how he came from having dreams of his own greatness to being able to accurately interpret other people's dreams. Like, how did he know he could do that for other people based on his own, just having his own excitement about what his own dreams could potentially mean, especially when I guess it comes back to the question of faith, but he's in a prison. Like his dreams talk about how great he's going to be someday, but the last several years of his life have been crummy. He was nearly killed by his brothers, then sold into slavery, and like Potiphar is a decent master. He like climbs the ranks of the servants pretty quickly, but he's still a slave, and then he's put in jail for refusing to have an affair with his master's wife. Like it's not great. So for him to be in that position and still be confident that he interpreted his own dreams correctly, that someday he will still have this position of prominence, and that means he'll be able to accurately interpret other people's dreams. I don't know. I just think it's a leap.
Well,
And
maybe that's a lesson in faith.
Right. Yeah. Torah is amazingly accurate when compared to history or archaeology. Was this revealed through the subconscious? Okay, I'm not entirely sure what you're saying there, but I do think, there is a practice of like Jewish dream interpretation that traditionally it gets into the mysticism, which is not my forte, but we can ask Rabbi Dennis about that on Sunday.
Yeah.
And more contemporarily, it also gets into like Freudian dream interpretation, which I understand nominally better, but still don't super buy into. So
It's
I think,
embedded in its time.
yeah. I
And
think
some of
like,
it's, go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
No. I've got loose lips today.
No, I want to hear what you have to say about dream interpretation.
I was just going to say, although some of the interpretations are timeless.
Mm-hmm. Dreams, go ahead, Joel.
Just take a simple concept of the belief that there is one God. It's not actually a belief, it's a true fact. So imagine living among all these polytheists who, they have a God for every single thing, for the harvest, this, that. And suddenly here is at least one person, let's call him Abraham, who it comes to him, not through any evidence. He didn't do any research, but it just came to him somehow or other that there is one God who has actually created everything. Now, looking at that from 2020, our point of view, it's so clear. Look at all of life. We can look at the DNA. We can see how related everything is. But if you are Abraham and somehow you have this thing just hits you into your subconscious, or, of course, he didn't know those words, but it became clear to at least one person who was Av Raham, the father of many. We are the many. And this is what we follow. This is what binds us together. And everything I've looked at, I'm very interested in history. I'm very archaeology. Suddenly 150 years ago, they make a discovery in Turkey. Oh, they're the Hittites, and they have this entire civilization. Guess what? That's 150 years ago. Before that, for the last 1850 years ago, in our era, people said, "Oh no, that's just a made-up story. No, nothing to it." All of a sudden, here we are today, and it just drops right into our lap. So yes, we have to separate out. There's a lot of mashal in Torah. Mashal is metaphor, okay? So like, for example, Nes Kadol Hayasham. I spin the dreidel, and the four sides, a great miracle happened there. But as I achieved, by the way, I am a student. I'm the pupil that you're talking to. I'm the 5-year-old, spiritually speaking. So when I hear the word nace, and over the years, I come to study it and understand it, it does not mean a miracle the way we're talking about it. Nace means a sign, an ensign, a sail of a ship. Just look at the Hebrew words, and there's so much wisdom there. And I said, oh my God, I've been hearing this miracle. I've been struggling. What's a miracle? This, that, oil lasts 8 days. And now it's so clear when I just look at the reality. So I think that's what we all have to do. We have to look at the reality. We have to overlook the metaphor. Our existence here today, my existence is metaphor. It's metaphor. Our real existence is in our spiritual world. We all inherit that. I go to sleep at night. I have questions, like things I can't figure out. I wake up early in the morning. It's so clear. It's right in front of me. Okay, I say, what did I dream about? I don't know. Snippet here and there. But I know that these little problems become very clear. My thinking becomes very clear overnight.
Joel, could you talk more? I'm intrigued by we, the physical being, we are a metaphor, our physical being?
Yes, science will tell us that we're mostly empty space. If you look at the structure of molecules, look at the structure of atoms,
Right.
the amount of matter is so infinitesimally small compared with the space.
Right.
What I see as my physical embodiment is really space. It really consists of electrons and neutrons and protons. So, okay, so where did all that stuff come from? It was created. It wasn't here forever. All we have to look at is the beginning of time. Okay, 14.7 billion years ago. And so even the physicist. Now, when I was 8 or 9 years old in general science, we had studied how the world came into being. So one was called the Big Bang Theory. A second one was called steady state. Another was plasma coalescence. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, they gave me a test. I'm a little kid. Okay, that's the question, big essay question. As it turns out, I had already studied it in Hebrew school. So for me, it was very simple, and I just got started and ran with it. Of course, it's the Big Bang Theory, blah, blah, blah. Here I am years later. Now everyone says, oh yeah, Big Bang Theory, okay. Okay, even if we think about time, like I remember what I had for dinner yesterday. I cannot remember what I have for dinner tomorrow. Tomorrow didn't come yet. How come? I can remember yesterday. All I have to do is I can look, there was a beginning of time, and now I haven't reached tomorrow yet. Just look at Einstein, everything that Einstein shared with us. Okay, time is relative, time-space continuum. So in other words, all these things are being revealed to Einstein. He shared them with us. And I can even see in Torah, it's a progression. Things are being revealed to us step by step by step. And that's why we have to study it. That's what we're doing now, so that we have a good understanding of who we are, what our role is. So, we always want to be concerned. And what I've been focusing on this week is our God is a very jealous God. The word is kana, very jealous. That may be more important than anything else. So what we have to do is we have to align ourselves with, yes, there is one God. Anything else that discusses okay, let them be happy in their beliefs, whatever they want to do. But I know there is one God. Just read the Torah. It's the whole message. So we can find a lot of truth. And that's why I love to hear what Rabbi Goldstein tells me. And it's not just for this hour, it will carry me through all week. And I will look it up, I'll study it, I'll think about it.
Mm.
And I'll align my thinking with Rabbi Goldstein's.
Thank you, Joe. So what do you do with the concept of a jealous God?
That's a good question.
Yes. Well, what would that mean to you?
Well, see, to me, like I said, I'm, totally oversimplify things, I'm quite sure. But I see this in terms of human relationships. So to me, it says, God is not perfect. We are not perfect, but we work towards being better.
Mm-hmm.
So if
Go
we're
ahead.
created by a God, our God is our Father. We are all B'nai Israel, all children. Okay, we're brothers and sisters. Now, I have children, and if my sons don't have good feelings about each other, that upsets me very much.
Mhm.
Very important. And that's why it's so important that we treat one another in a very gracious way. So I think that just falls under the central theme. Central theme is it's the creator of the universe. We wouldn't be here. All the philosophers of Europe, that's really what they're asking. They're saying, why am I here? What am I doing here? What's my purpose? I'm not going to be here forever. So while I'm here, let me do what I have to do.
Yeah. And, Maimonides, of course, has everything to say about how these anthropomorphic adjectives around God are, they're all metaphor. There's all it's to help us understand how we live our lives, not an actual description of God. That God doesn't actually have these human emotions of jealousy, but that it's a way to explain to our feeble human brains how God expects us to behave toward each other and to have faith, to treat each other graciously, to all these things that we're talking about, which I think we see very strongly in Joseph, even though at the very beginning he comes across as an arrogant brat. But to be fair, he's a kid and his father dotes on him and treats him as the favorite. So we can't really expect him to act differently. But he does learn forgiveness, faith, strength of spirit, you know, he develops into a very strong character. That I think is significant. I'm curious what you all think about chapter 38. Do you have any thoughts on what this is doing here?
It sort of was stuck in, like, it's almost like, well, it says while this was about that time. So while this was happening, and so I guess maybe nothing very interesting was happening in Egypt right now, because Joseph was just taking care of Potiphar's stuff and so while that was going on, let's go back over here and see what's happening with Judah. And and I was trying to find some parallels, but didn't succeed. Not really.
Yeah, it's a little strange. I guess it does help kind of place us in time. You know, he's old enough. We don't have a great sense of how old all the brothers are when they sell Joseph, but now we at least understand they've grown somewhat. And Judah, at least, who is second in line, I think, he's on the older side of the 12. He's old enough to have grown children who are marrying and trying to have, you know, theoretically old enough to have grandchildren. So that sets us up a little bit in the scope of the broader narrative. And the child at the end, Perez, is a direct ancestor to King David. So that's significant. But otherwise,
I mean, quite a long time goes, because it's about this time. So we're just about when they sold Joseph off. That's when Judah gets married, and then his sons get old enough to marry before they end up going to Egypt themselves. So quite a lot of time is going by.
right.
But maybe that's not necessary to look at that real carefully, because it just different authors or whatever, like you say.
Yeah. I don't know. I just think it's kind of funny that it feels, like you said, it feels really stuck in. And there's, you know, from this, I believe, is where the tradition of, I'm blanking on what it's called, but there's like a ceremony with the shoe to so if, you know, if a woman is widowed, childless, and she's supposed to marry her brother-in-law to continue the line, there's like a ceremony where the brother-in-law gives her a sandal to like exempt, so that they don't have to actually get married. I can't remember now the details, but it comes from because the marrying of the brothers-in-law ends up so poorly in Tamar's case. Joel, can you fill in some details here?
Sure. So it's known as Levirate in Hebrew. In English, it's called levirate marriage, Levirate. What that says is this. In that society, if your brother passes on and has no children, you have to supply seed to that woman so that your dead brother's son's name will not disappear and his property will remain within the family, so to say. It's a very good role. Now, later on in Deuteronomy, the man also has the opposite. Let's say you don't like your brother's taste in women. You can refuse. And it's called halitza. Okay. And at that point, where the sandal comes in. So that's kind of breaking. Of course, that's all gone now. We don't have that anymore in Judaism. So chapter 38, a little interlude, and right in the first line, 38:1, the key word is Vayered Yehuda. Yered is the opposite of Allah, Ayin Lamed Yud. And like the word Aliyah. Aliyah means you go up to the Torah, or it also means if you're going to move to Israel, it's you're making Aliyah, you're moving up spiritually. If you go to the Torah, you're going up spiritually. Also, if you do not eat chazir is pig. So, and the reason being, on a number of occasions, there's ma'alot geirah. So the pig, lo ma'alot geirah. The pig does not, again, bring up. It's the same word, bring up. Does not bring up cud. That's the proper way to say it. The pig does not bring up cud, means he doesn't chew his cud the way a cow does, or a goat. Okay, it's called a rumination. Rumination is bringing up the cud. They're re-chewing their food, and you just look at how the animal's constructed. All right, so Vayered Yehuda, it says Joseph Yehuda had gone down in his brother's eyes. Yehuda. In other words, he was the firstborn of Leah, but he was pretty far down on the list. Reuven was on the top. So here's Yehuda, he had gone down. This whole story explains how Yehuda has to bring himself back up. He says, oh yes, Tamar, she is more righteous than me. He said, I made a mistake. And this is throughout Torah. And this speaks to us today. Okay, I make mistakes every day, every week, but I can bring myself up again. And of course, Yehuda is very important because at some point, the bloodline goes through Yehuda, okay, including right down to King David and right down to us.
Well, through Tamar also, like I said.
Yes.
For King David, I mean.
And if you look at the word Yehuda, very interesting. A couple weeks ago, we studied this pretty thoroughly. Yehuda is from the word Odeh. Odeh means thanks, giving thanks. And when Leah gave birth to Yehuda, she said to God, oh, I give thanks that I had one more person. Therefore, I'm going to make his name Yehuda. Yehuda, it means giving thanks. I have thanksgiving for this boy.
Yehuda.
So, what's amazing about Torah is how it's a tapestry. And you can take any one thread and you can follow it through. Okay, so 38, he's going to come back up in stature. Yehuda is going to become our forefather. We're going to become known as Yehudim. Same word, because we give thanks for being here. And that's how I'm going to tie that together with the creation of the universe. I give a lot of thanks for that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here.
Beautiful, Josh.
This is one of the few stories that we've read that a woman has pretty much equal footing with the guy in the story. I mean, not that in the, you know what I'm trying to say. The story is about her as much as it is about
Right.
Yehuda.
Yes, and that she's still the I don't know, the winner or whatever. Like there's a lot running through it that point. It's one of those places in the Torah where Rabbi Elliot Dorff would say, we have to recognize what the world was at the time and appreciate how our ancestors were progressive for their time and understand that we continue to progress for our time as well. So like there are lots of hints in it about the sexism and misogyny and whatever of her life, that she has to have a son in this line, like that otherwise she'll lose her own importance and worth, basically. She has to have this baby. Judah's authority to withhold that from her. The sort of dual, I mean, in the Hebrew, so the English, I think it says prostitution both times, but there is a difference between a cult prostitute and a street prostitute, and so in the Hebrew, one says Kadesha and one says Zona, which is, those are different words, but still there's like a little bit of hypocrisy on this idea that like Yehuda can go and have sex with a cult prostitute, but if Tamar is believed to have engaged in harlotry, that's not okay. Whatever. There's all of these like hints leading up that still kind of point to the issues of the day, but then the fact that in the end, we can see how very clever she is. She gets what she wants. She gets the baby. And Yehuda has to admit that, like, he put her in a position to need to be cunning. He did her wrong, and she did the right thing. And she, that she is more righteous than I. That, like, it all comes together. That I think is a really beautiful hint into that Judaism should be a progressive religion.
And the story starts with Yehuda's wife not even getting a name. He marries the daughter of somebody or another, and that's she's mentioned several. It tells us when she dies, but even then she doesn't get a name. She's just
dead.
But she
she's
clearly
just
was
somebody's
more
daughter.
than her sisters-in-law, because although we know that all of the brothers had children, right? There's a tribe for every name, but we never know their wives' names. Or not only we don't know their wives' names, we never see them mentioned. We never know when Reuben gets married or whatever. If he's already married when he has the affair with Bilhah, what does his wife think about that? Or if Bilhah is the wife. Anyway, I don't know. My point is we get no information about the mothers of these tribes. So Judah's wife clearly merited some mention in something she did, but not a name. Yeah. Let's see. And then it ends
Looking at the
with
risks.
the
I couldn't remember.
cupbearer getting out of jail, right? Yeah. The butler. So there's the continuation of the narrative is pretty smooth. Sometimes some parshas, they feel like they jump from one parsha to the next, or like, the time span of from when Jacob runs away from home to when he gets to Haran to when he, leaves or whatever. Like it can be kind of jumbled, or we lose track of the time jumps and whatever. And I guess that happens a little bit here. We don't know how long Joseph was enslaved or imprisoned or whatever. But I do feel like maybe because it's mostly in one place or like mostly focused just on Joseph or whatever, but it's a smoother part of the Torah narrative. Other than the little Tamar insert.
I mean, that is a question, as we've been reading, sometimes the portion stops at the end of a story. Sometimes it's it's in the middle.
Yeah.
Sometimes like there was one recently where there was like only 2 sentences left to the story, and yet the parsha stopped before those 2 sentences.
Yeah.
And so it made me wonder how the portions got. I mean, was it just length, or was it narrative, or there was no, we don't know why, or
It's when the scribe had to go to dinner.
End of chapter. It's a good question. I think it is mostly length so that it can still easily, I mean, some are still longer than others, but I think it's about still like then breaking the parsha up into 7 readings theoretically and getting through the whole parsha in one Saturday morning service. Yeah, so I think that's how it's determined, but it is kind of funny when it ends, like it feels like the parsha leaves off in the middle of a narrative, and then the next parsha begins on on verse like 4 of the new chapter, and it's like why couldn't we just finish the chapter? I don't. It's funny like that, but it was done so long ago. Not as long as like the canonization of the Bible, but because public Torah readings go back, I mean, to about the time the canonization, our early recordings of the Parshiot, still they're already determined or broken up by the Mishnah, which is not that long after it was all more or less canonized. So let's see. Joel says in the chat, Zonah is an important word, describes the unfaithful Israelite community. That's true. A more primitive root, commit female adultery. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So just about the root Zonah, the harlot. So there's it means whore, and it still does, like in modern, it's a slang insult in modern Hebrew as well. Instead of son of a bitch, they call someone a ben zonah, son of a whore. But it's also used a lot. It's used a bit in some of the prophets, which I don't know if we talked about that, the Hebrew word, but it's definitely appears in the concept in some of the prophets, and will come up a lot in Lamentations when we study that in January. That Israel is a zonah, or that Israel went zonahing, went whoring after foreign gods, and there's a lot of imagery, and it's like, yeah, it's a metaphor for idolatry, but it's not just like, I don't think, at least in Lamentations and in the prophets, it might be used elsewhere so directly, but it's the whole metaphor is wrapped up together. It's not just like zonah is used as a word for idolatry. It's like because the Jewish people and God are married, and the covenant at Sinai is a ketubah, and all of these things, that committing idolatry is akin to committing adultery, and that's where, so it's very much tied in with God as the spurned husband, and there's some imagery in Lamentations, and I think also Isaiah, not just that Israel is a zonah, but also like it gets like pretty descriptive about like describing Israel as a woman having her clothes torn in the streets and being paraded through and whatever. That's like it's pretty descriptive. There were no chapters. Well, there were no, but there were parshiot. Like in the, at least in the commentaries and stuff, they definitely give parshiot citations when the Talmud refers to parts of the Torah. Yeah, Joel.
Okay, the verses have been there forever because at the end of each verse, the cantillation is sof pasuk. That's the musical tune that tells us that we're at the end of every single verse. But the chapters, no. Now we do have divisions called Satuma and Patucha
Uh-huh.
in the Torah. Do you ever notice you're looking at a Torah, it looks like, oh my God, they stopped the writing and now they're beginning on the next line. And another time, oh, they stopped the writing, they're beginning again about an inch or two later. Okay, the inch or two later is called Satuma. Satuma in your Chumash, if you look at any Chumash that you have, almost any Chumash, you'll see the letter Pei and the letter Samach throughout. And for example, and it's not a regular thing. Maybe you can go for like 20 verses and oops, there's the Samach. You go another 5 verses and there's the Patucha, the Peh. So in other words, that tells us where there is a break in the central idea of what they're talking about. So in the Torah, it's done with spaces. And in our Chumash, they actually indicate the letter Pei and the letter Samach. It's right in there. I think it's widely overlooked. But if you look at the Torah scroll, you can't avoid it. It's right there.
But my point is, there weren't necessarily chapters like we have chapter 1, chapter 2, whatever.
It's Stephen Langdon. That's the guy I put in the chat. Stephen Langdon invented that because the Christian scholars, it would take them 15 minutes to find the place in the Torah scroll. Like they'd wait half the hour just trying to find the place. So he was the guy, he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the first guy to come up with that idea. Of course, the Jewish guys were printing a Chumash. We said, this is a good idea. Let's do it. Let's follow it. Chapter 38. But that did not exist in the times of the Bible. It did not exist before around 1225 AD.
Right. But public Torah readings had accepted segments that aren't just, I mean, a parsha can contain multiple
Yes.
samachs and pays. Like those breaks aren't the only way that they were already broken up from the time of, you know,
Yes.
of the still in the Second Temple period when public Torah readings were a weekly event. They pretty quickly established, probably not right away. I mean, I'm sure there was some kind of decision-making process that's not well recorded, but as of the Mishnah, there is an accepted length of like what you read each week. You know, what constitutes a parsha, which like roughly parsha is translated as chapter, but like that makes it hard because we also have these English chapters that, you know, that don't correspond necessarily with the part, but you know what I'm saying, like partial, yeah. So I think back to Debbie's original question, that partial were parsed by length and what felt like the correct amount of time to sit through 7 sections on a Saturday morning and still make it through the whole Torah in a year. And now most conservative synagogues they have a triennial reading, so they don't actually read, they still do 7 sections, but they're shorter. So the parsha is cut up into thirds. And so for 1 year, they read the first third of each parsha, and then the second year they read the second third of each parsha, and then the third year they read the third of each parsha, so that it's shorter, but that over time still the whole parsha gets read, or the whole Torah gets read, as opposed to what we and a lot of Reform synagogues do is like, I pick the section of the parsha that's like what my sermon is on, and that's what I choose to read. And so it can be the same section 3 years in a row, or wildly different, or you know, there's not so much a rhythm to it. But yeah. And then in most Orthodox synagogues, they still just do the
whole thing.
whole thing,
Mm.
which I imagine takes a while. That's okay. They're ready to spend all of Saturday in shul.
It's Shabbat, yeah, so nothing else to do, so.
It's also why they stroll in, you know, just in time for the Torah service, because it's still gonna be an hour, so
Isn't that
no
the
reason to be there for Pesukei to Zimra. What?
origin of Jewish time?
Yeah.
Like if you're going
It's funny
to an
'cause
Episcopalian wedding, and if they say they're going to start at 2:00, you better be there right at 2:00.
yeah.
Jewish folk are going to come 2:30. They haven't even started.
Yeah. Well, but you know, I have this new crusade that if you take all of the ethnic stereotypes, collectively, a lot of them apply to the majority of the world. So I've decided we're not late, because if Jews, Middle Easterners, which maybe that's redundant, but whatever, like Arabs also, Greeks, Black people, they all claim to like run on their own time. So you know what? We're not late. The Episcopalians are early. Same thing. Like we have similar stereotypes about being over obsessed with food, or having overbearing mothers, or being stingy, whatever. Like, no, sorry, you have withholding mothers, you don't eat enough, and you're ostentatious. Like, sorry, collectively there's more of us. So I don't know why we apply these same stereotypes separately like that and pretend like white Christians are the norm.
For a college class, I had to read a book called The Silent Language, which talked about cultural differences, including time, and talked about the South American idea that you don't, if an event starts at 2, you don't get there till 2:30, although I never understood how movies and plays and things like that could manage along those lines. And it also talked about the distance that you stood from somebody when you talked to them, and how if you had a North American and a South American trying to have a conversation, you could walk all the way down the hall because one would be backing up and one would be moving forward. And
I do find that. I used to work in a very multicultural kitchen, and the Eastern Europeans would just like come and hover like right over your shoulder. And the head chef was South African. I was the only American. And then and there was sometimes a Jamaican, and so the South African, myself, and the Jamaican would be like Try to chop onions here. And the Russians would be like, ah. Yep. So that one I don't, I do know that's a thing, but I have less, I see less consistency throughout different ethnic minorities
Yep. Yep.
on this spatial thing. But yeah. Anyway, well, that was a fun way to end. Remember that there is a playlist on YouTube that in chunks, about 10-minute chunks, shows the entirety of Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So it's a good time of year to go find that. Go watch it, refresh yourself. And we'll continue next week with me, Kets.
Happy Hanukkah, everybody.
Hanukkah.
Oh, happy Hanukkah. Have a good week too.
Yes, indeed.
Bye.
Night or good
night.
afternoon.
All right.